which is Professor Nadje Ali, who was at SOAS. Okay, if any of you know anybody in London, yeah, you really get and say, I just heard somebody that you just lost from SOAS. SOAS stands for the School of Oriental and African Studies. But if you're hip in London, you just say SOAS. And I met Nadje when she was, until just recently, a professor at SOAS, mentored wonderful students there, but also was one of the co-founders of the Center for Gender Studies at SOAS. SOAS is a very radicalizing university, a very worldly university with students from all over the world. And Nadje is one of the professors who made it great, but they just lost her. They lost her down the road here to Providence, right? So if you're in London, of course you want to leave Providence. Nadje, really, I was first introduced to Nadje's work on Iraqi women, and the first book of hers I read was called Iraqi Women, and it was just really on the kind of morning after of the U.S.-led invasion into Iraq. And I don't know about you all, but here I was, part of a country that was invading, a country about which Americans knew nothing, as in zilch, as in zero, as in could they find it on the map. And in my own teaching, I thought, look, this is horrible. First of all, I'm so ignorant about it. This was back in 2003. And I wanted to assign a book that I thought would engage students from all over the world, but especially from the U.S., in learning about Iraqis. And I wanted to learn about the Iraqi women's movement. And so it was Nadje Ali's book, Iraqi Women, that I found. It was the only one available at the time. Students gobbled it up, and all of a sudden, of course, they said, you mean there's something called an Iraqi women's movement? How come we never heard about this? How come in the news we still weren't hearing about it? Then Nadje, with the co-author, wrote a book about women under the American occupation of Iraq. What's it like to try and live your life as a woman, especially as a woman with activist rights-oriented demands? What's it like living under the U.S. military occupation in Iraq? And this is a book called What Kind of Liberation? It's still definitely worth reading. So the first one is Iraqi Women. Second one is What Kind of Liberation? It's one of the few books we have that says, what is it like trying to be a woman activist under an American-led occupation of your country? What's that like? What are you trying to do? What kind of strategies? Most recently, Nadje has a book coming out. She's a great teacher, she's a great organizer, she's very politically active, and she publishes books. Her book that's just coming out, let me make sure I get it right, is called Gender, Islam, and Governance. I'm trying to think how those three go together. What does governance have to do with Islam and gender? And this book is coming out this fall, isn't it? It's coming out this fall. In October, there's going to be a book launch down in Providence, and there will be another in New York City as well as one in London. Nadje herself, though, of course, is already, if you have a book coming out and you're Nadje, you're already working on the next book. And her next book is Gender and Sexuality in the Middle East. It already has a publisher, so look for it. And so it's with enormous privilege, sense of privilege, and honor to introduce Nadje Ali to UMass Boston.
Thanks so much, Cynthia and Carol. Where are you? Yeah, I'm really, really happy to be here. I've been here before, and it was great coming to the States, knowing that I have friends and colleagues close by, and I'm very glad that you're all here today. So the talk that I'm giving today really grows out of research and activism I've done in different contexts. It is trying to chart my trajectories and dilemmas as a feminist activist and academic who has written about gender-based violence in different contexts. Mainly in today, I'm looking at Iraq, Turkey, and Lebanon. But writing about gender-based violence and trying to do that in the context of Islamophobia and racism. So that is a big dilemma that many of us who are based in Western context, but writing about the Middle East are facing. Because, on the one hand, we want to challenge the inequalities, the forms of oppressions, and certainly forms of gender-based violence that women and some men are facing in the region. At the same time, we don't want to contribute to the growing Islamophobia and racism. So, often what happens when I give a talk, I have given talks about Iraq, just focusing on Iraq for 45 minutes, and at some point in my talk, I would mention that there has been an increase in honor-based killings in Iraq following the invasion in 2003. And my talk, I thought, was very nuanced, but then when we have a discussion, I get the feeling that the only thing that my audience took away is Iraqi fathers kill their daughters, okay? Which is not what I was saying at all. I said there's an increase in honor-based killings. So then I am faced with the dilemma, am I mentioning it again in my next talk, or am I not speaking about it? Okay. So clearly, the way we as scholars, activists, write, talk about, analyze, and present gender-based violence in the Middle East and also its diasporas is very much linked to our respective positionalities. And when I say positionalities, I do not just mean, our ethnicity, race, class, but it's a combination, where do we stand politically? And while our positionalities in terms of identities might not determine our politics, they do shape them and certainly influence that what we emphasize in our analysis and our findings at any given moment. However, I think this is very important to stress, these positionalities might not only be shifting depending on whom we are addressing and when, so whether I speak to you or I speak to an audience in London, or I speak to an audience in Cairo or in Beirut, so my positionality and my emphasis might be shifting, but also in response to transformations in the prevailing discourses and analysis surrounding us. So we're reacting not only to our audiences, but also the prevailing ways people speak about things. And based on my own experiences, I would also argue that specific empirical contexts and realities, with their different histories of oppression and resistance, will also impact on the way we understand and conceptualize particular instances of gender-based violence, and what we will emphasize and stress in our interpretations and presentations. Now, this paper that I'm presenting to you today is the attempt to bridge and mediate between different approaches and positionalities, which are often presented or perceived to be at loggerheads or in opposition, but in my view, actually all present a range of significant positions and approaches along a complex spectrum. This might be a bit abstract, but I will explain it to you later what I mean with that. So in the context of my research and activism in Iraq, I have in my work emphasized the importance of historicizing gender-based violence. So what do I mean by historicizing? There is sort of this tendency to just look at the present, to look at the current moment, but not put things into historical perspective. And so this actually what this does, it presents a very myopic view that tends to absolve a wide range of perpetrators, but also historical complicities and silences. And I would say this is evident in contemporary representations of gender-based violence in Iraq. To put it simply, thinking about contemporary Iraq it is not all about ISIS or Daesh. Now, the UK and US occupation, various Iraqi governments and their militia, insurgents and sectarian groups, armed gangs, and individual family members have all been perpetrators of the most vile forms of gender-based violence in Iraq, ranging from domestic violence, verbal and physical intimidation, sexual harassment, rape, forced marriage, trafficking, forced prostitution, female genital mutilation, and honor-based crimes, including killings. Meanwhile, Iraqi and Kurdish feminist activists, who have been at the forefront of struggling against gender-based, but also other forms of violence linked to authoritarianism and sectarianism, but also the occupation, point to the fact that international outrage about ISIS kidnapping, enslavement, forced marriages, rapes, and torture of Yazidi women has neither translated into adequate material and political support nor into asylum rights. So on the one hand, you have this outrage about the different forms of gender-based violence that ISIS has been engaged with. But certainly this country is not providing either support, like political support, nor asylum rights for Yazidi women. Similarly, although this is being glossed over by many Iraqi feminists themselves, gender-based violence and other forms of atrocities have also been committed by Shia militia against Arab Sunnis. So this is maybe a bit complicated if you don't know Iraq, but so ISIS is a Sunni extremist group, and because, I mean, to put it very simply, in the fight against ISIS, the atrocities committed by Shia militias have been often swept under the carpet. In recent years, I have increasingly recognized my own pitfalls and difficulties in talking about gender-based violence in Iraq. So this is because I wanted to refrain either from contributing to the sensationalizing and essentialist culturalist discourses so common in Western media. So what I mean here is, oh, it's because of their culture, it's because of Islam, it's because they're Arab, it's because they're Middle Eastern, right? So I didn't want to contribute to that. But at the same time, I didn't want to engage in the taboo and silencing of gender-based violence within, which is very common within domestic Iraqi politics. So this kind of dilemma has been very challenging. And I've argued previously that in practice, this tension is often reduced to explanatory frameworks that firmly root violence within neo-colonial, imperialist, and neoliberal policies, particularly those linked to the US and Israel. And on the other hand, activists, and I would say to a lesser extent academics, but acutely the media and policymakers, very restrictively reference national and local cultures and local manifestations of patriarchy as sources of gender-based inequalities and forms of oppression. So just to repeat, so this kind of, very sort of dichotomous thinking. So either it's, imperialism, colonialism, neoliberalism, Zionism that's responsible, or it is, local cultures often conflated with religion. Right? So it comes as no surprise that much of my own scholarship and activism on Iraq and in Iraq has been motivated by the strong wish to write against this culturalization of gender-based violence, specifically in relation to the post-invasion context. And the wider political and academic aim to challenge essentialized ideas of Middle Eastern exceptionalism and conflated notions of Muslim, Arab, Middle Eastern, and Iraqi culture is clearly an ongoing and familiar incentive for many of us researching and writing on women and gender issues. But clearly, clearly the impact of the invasion and occupation on Iraq had to be central to my analysis of shifting gender norms and relations in Iraq. More recently, however, and here the but comes in, I have felt a growing sense of discomfort with the tendency by some scholars and activists, and I would say scholars mainly based in this country, to solely focus on the ongoing impact of the invasion and occupation, as well as neoliberal economics, without recognizing not simply complicity, but proactive involvement of various local and regional actors. Obviously, these are linked and entangled, but I would argue cannot be conflated. I would also like to stress here that blind spots are not merely the prerogative of Western scholars and activists. As we already know in the context of many diasporic communities, radical, uncompromising positions and fervent nationalism can often be stronger if you're miles away and mobilized in relative safety. During the occupation of Iraq, for example, I was taken aback by many Iraqi diaspora activists actively supporting the increasingly sectarian insurgents who were involved in the killing of Iraqi civilians in their fight against occupation and imperialism more widely. So, for instance, I was, at some point in 2007, I was invited to a big world tribunal on Iraq in Istanbul, and all the speakers for 3 days were standing there and saying, oh, we have to support the armed resistance against US occupation. And in 2005, 2006, the resistance insurgents were killing on a daily basis Iraqi civilians at marketplaces, outside on the street. So I actually felt very uncomfortable and distanced myself, from that support. Meanwhile, in post-invasion Iraq, the Kurdistan regional government, so you have Iraq, you have central and southern Iraq, that is governed by the central government in Baghdad, and then you have the north of Iraq that's governed by the Kurdish regional government. And the Kurdish regional government has been far more proactive in reacting to pressures by women's rights activists than the central government in Baghdad, seeking state protection from the widespread gender-based violence that has also been prevalent in the Kurdish region. Yet despite various legal reforms, women in Iraqi Kurdistan experience high levels of gender-based violence, particularly in terms of honor-based violence and female genital cutting, as the work of my former PhD student and now colleague Haji Keli illustrates eloquently. Domestic violence is rampant as well, but remains underreported and unprosecuted. Moreover, it is apparent that the Kurdish regional government has made instrumental use of gender issues to present itself as more democratic and progressive than the Shia Islamist and Arab-controlled Iraqi government in the central government, especially when it comes to the international donor community and also the international political community. Although women activists in Iraqi Kurdistan were far more successful than their counterparts in central and southern Iraq in influencing government legislation on gender issues, in practice it emerged that the Kurdish regional government is interested in neither in involving women in the executive nor in actually implementing legislation that is supposed to protect women from gender-based violence. Government officials argue that their priority has to be security and stability as opposed to women's rights. In central and southern Iraq, as well as in the Kurdish region of Iraq, the impact of heightened and long-lasting militarization of society, in conjunction with the continued and often growing significance of tribal affiliations, ethnic conflict, and widespread sectarian and religious extremism, have all contributed to a striking continuum of violence. The privileging of militarized masculinities, whether in acute conflict situations or at home, has developed side by side with the privileging of conservative gender norms and relations that stress women's honor and need for protection and control. Women's rights and gender norms have been used as bargaining chips, both vis-à-vis the international community to show a facade of egalitarianism and vis-à-vis conservative tribal and religious authorities that were placated with more stringent controls and regulation. It is against this background of widespread gender-based violence across Iraq, but also my frustration with corruption and adoption of neoliberal and neoconservative interpretations of women's rights and women's empowerment among many women's rights activists, that I decided to shift focus for a while and engage in research on the Kurdish women's movement linked to the PKK, that is the Kurdistan Workers' Party. So that is grew out of the Kurdish struggle in Turkey. I was desperately looking for a more hopeful context and wishing for more radical feminist politics than what I saw in Iraq. At the time when I was thinking to do this was in 2015, a peace process between the Turkish government and the Kurdish political movement was still active and looked promising, and I was intrigued by the apparent centrality of gender-based justice within the wider political movement in Turkey and in northern Syria, also sometimes referred to as Rojava. Now, the research I was engaged with for a few years aimed to go beyond the sensationalized or glorified discussion of Kurdish women's militancy and participation in armed resistance, while recognizing the achievements made over the past decades. Against an exploration of the historical developments of both political ideology and mobilization, I have researched and analyzed the relationship between theory and practice in terms of gender-based equality and justice within both the armed units as well as the political legal movement linked to the PKK. Now, at the time of actually engaging in empirical work, so this is September 2015, I started to do research so this was research amongst Kurdish women activists in southeastern Turkey in the late summer, so August, September of 2015. The Turkish army and police had already started its recent systematic crackdown, destruction of towns, and mass arrest of Kurdish activists, mayors, and MPs. So my work on the Turkish-Kurdish conflict and the relationship between peace and feminist activism has forced me to rethink previous assumptions about the way local women's rights activists conceptualize violence in the context of wide-scale oppression, atrocities, and human rights abuses. And I was sort of informed by my readings and encounters with Palestinian women activists and also scholars who work on Palestine. And they're in a context where international donor organizations are speaking about Palestinian culture or Islamic culture when it comes to gender-based violence, Palestinian women's rights activists and scholars, rightly so in my view, have to constantly stress the impact of the occupation on women and gender relations. And so I was expecting a similar situation in the Turkish-Kurdish conflict, given that Turkey, although obviously there are huge differences between Turkey and Israel, but it's also a form of settler colonialism. So, Kurdish women, similar to Palestinian women, have experienced marginalization and discrimination, and they have been treated as second-class citizens. But they have also had to endure the often patronizing attitude of Turkish feminists. Over the past 3 decades, Kurdish women's rights activists have systematically pushed back against the essentializing culturalization discourses of Turkish feminists, especially those of the older generation, influenced by Kemalist, modernist, and nationalist narratives. So when I say Kemalist, so this is part of the Turkish state, the Turkish Republic, the ideology which is sort of based on the idea of modernization, which is very much equated with westernization and secularization. And here, Kurdish culture, Kurdish women were kind of perceived to be backward and that they needed to be modernized, and Turkish feminists were part of that narrative for a long time. As several Kurdish and Turkish activists I talked to stressed, honor-based killings and wider gender-based violence within Kurdish society have historically been represented both by the Turkish state and Turkish feminists as a consequence of tribal culture, enabling the positioning of the state and military as modernizers and liberators who need to intervene. Now, while clearly pointing to the structural inequalities and root causes of gender-based violence linked to the Turkish state, to my surprise, the Kurdish women I talked to stressed the importance of not losing sight of the atrocities committed by their fellow Kurdish men, referring to patriarchy as a defining cause of ongoing instances of violence experienced by Kurdish women. Throughout my research in Turkey and the diaspora, that is in London and Berlin, with Kurdish women's rights activists, female fighters, mayors and MPs, it became obvious that the struggle against gender-based inequalities and violence has become a core aim of the Kurdish political movement, integral to its struggle for cultural, political, and legal and economic rights. In fact, many women's rights activists told me that conflict exists not only between the Kurdish political movement and the Turkish state, but also between Kurdish women and men due to patriarchal authoritarianism. And that for me was really quite shocking because it was very different from everything that I knew in different political contexts where you had such a stark structural inequality in terms of, the Turkish state, the systematic forms of oppression and inequalities on behalf of the Turkish state. Ayla Ala Akad, for example, a prominent Kurdish women's rights activist and former HDP MP, so HDP is a Kurdish-led progressive political party in Turkey, she stated in an interview in Diyarbakir in September 2015, I quote, "Our male comrades are also representing the power of the state. The freedom of women has to be a priority. There are 4 different articles in the Turkish constitution that we want to change. We could solve the Kurdish national cause in Turkey by addressing these 4 articles. But women's rights do not depend on changing articles in the constitution." Ayla Akaata's statement, resonating with the views of other interviewees, runs counter to the historical and cross-cultural expectation that women's rights and gender-based claims tend to be sidelined for wider political claims pertaining to national struggle. In contrast, Atta and other activists I talked to link state power to male power. So struggling against the state also means struggling against male dominance and masculinist rule. Many of the women I talked to stressed that they viewed the conflict with their Kurdish male comrades as more challenging than the conflict with the state. But I have to say, this was in 2015. And I'm quite sure that if I would speak to the same women now, and I should say that more than half of the women I talked to in 2015 have been in prison, have been arrested since then. And I very much suspect that they would not say this right now because of what they've experienced over the last 4 years. But at the time, they said that the struggle with the Kurdish man is in a way more challenging than the struggle with the state. Looking at the diaspora, I found, so there's a large Kurdish diaspora in many European countries, also actually in the US. And I found that many respondents in the diaspora also conceptualized conflict and violence not only in ethnic and political, but also gender terms. A Turkish long-term feminist activist from Berlin, involved in the Kurdish political movement and an active member in the HDP, the political party I mentioned before, argued in November 2015 saying that women make up 50% of society, but in every society, even in Germany, so she was based in Germany, even in Germany, we have witnessed violence and forms of inequality against women. It is a global disease. Even modern states have not managed to end this issue. In the context of the Turkish-Kurdish conflict, we have also witnessed that. With the effect of ethnic and religious conflict or civil war, violence against women increases. Women, mothers from all sides, should come together to make peace. If we come together, if we refuse to send our sons and daughters to war for a political aim, then we can end both forms of violence together. Now, her articulation of the relationship between ethnic conflict, gender-based violence, and peace challenges the idea that gender-based violence is inherent in Kurdish, Turkish, or Muslim societies, but not in Western countries such as Germany. No doubt, a diasporic positionality is extremely complex and challenging in the current climate of heightened Islamophobia, racism, anti-refugee and anti-immigration sentiments, and the rise of right-wing movements and constituencies in Europe and North America. This became very apparent to me during a recent visit to Germany when I participated in a symposium in Berlin. The media featured numerous articles about gender-based violence amongst Muslim asylum seekers and refugees, following the rape and killing of a 13-year-old German girl at the hands of a young Iraqi Kurdish man. The man, a failed asylum seeker, had fled back to northern Iraq, but was caught by the Kurdish authorities. Now, it's not the time and place to go into details about the debates and discussions, but what upset myself and many of my friends what upset us most, of course, was the fact that a young woman was killed. But then in terms of discussion, what upset us most was the intervention of a white German anthropologist, self-proclaimed feminist, who announced that this was to be expected given that refugees came from patriarchal societies in which men hate women. In a classic sweep of exceptionalism projected onto the MENA region, so the Middle East and North Africa, Germany became a patriarchy-free society, and Middle Eastern and North African culture became generalized and essentialized in terms of hatred for women. Ever since the documented sexual harassment of women in Cologne on New Year's Eve of 2015-2016, outside the famous Cologne Cathedral by men of migrant background, mainly from North Africa, it has been extremely tricky for feminist scholars and activists in Germany to talk about and challenge racism, Islamophobia, and gender-based violence simultaneously. We have seen alliances of feminists and right-wing anti-refugee and anti-migrant activists and organizations. We have seen the glossing over gender-based violence and issues of gender-based discrimination in the name of fighting racism and Islamophobia. But Germany today is also home to a growing number of progressive and formal and more formal networks and organizations, mainly founded by women of migrant background who combine anti-racist and feminist positions in radical and creative ways. What might appear to be a detour on my behalf is, of course, at the heart of the conundrum of diaspora activists and those of us scholar activists based in Western contexts, having to challenge, fight, and resist the many different forms of racism and Islamophobia on a daily basis. It is also central to the tensions which emerged in recent years between scholars and activists based in Western contexts and scholars and activists based in the Middle East. In what follows, I will highlight this tension in the specific context of the LGBTQ activist scene in Beirut, drawing on my involvement with the Beirut-based journal Kohl, a journal of body and gender research. And that journal, by the way, is available online, both in English and Arabic, for free. In my own talks and engagement with academics and activists, I have critically engaged with, while occasionally also been at the receiving end of what might be coined polemically post-colonial feminist bashing. Here I'm referring to a trend among some activists in the Middle East who strongly criticize and dismiss some feminist scholars based in Western, mainly US institutions, who systematically challenge US policies and prevalent media representations of the Middle East and Islam. This phenomenon, while present across some feminist and LGBTQ activist communities in the Middle East, is particularly articulated and widespread in Beirut, the site of a dynamic young feminist activist scene, including LGBT activists and queer feminists. Over the past years, I have been following debates and tensions within the LGBTQ movement, as well amongst queer feminists, through my involvement as an advisory board member of the journal Kohol. And the journal was founded by a group of young queer feminist activists in Beirut who wanted to provide a platform to both young academics and activists to share their research and writings on gender and sexuality with reference to the Middle East and North Africa. Sorry. I have a problem with my throat. Throughout my involvement with Kohol, I was increasingly made aware of the way that LGBT activists as well as queer feminists felt beleaguered and under attack by local and regional conservative forces and constituencies, whether in the form of local corrupt and sectarian politicians, religious authorities, or family members. Even before the rise of ISIS or Daesh, there seemed to be a widespread sense that the activists strongly perceived culture and religion to matter in their struggles and the various forms of discrimination and violence they were experiencing because of not fitting in with heteronormative ideals. As a substantial group of feminist activists, particularly in Lebanon and Egypt, are educated in terms of being able to read, and many of them also read in English, and they have access to academic literature, some in translation. They are aware of the debates and theorizing in the broad fields of gender studies, especially when it comes to literature directly relevant to the region. And while referring to some scholars and their writings with respect and at times admiration, there is frequently a sense that many feminist academics based outside the Middle East tend to overemphasize the effects of imperialism and neoliberalism at the expense of recognizing the role of local conservative, social, and religious forces and constituencies. Now, the first time I was alerted to the tensions between Western-based academics and activists based in the Middle East was in a Gender in the Middle East postgraduate seminar at SOAS several years ago. One of our MA Gender Studies students, an extremely bright Lebanese queer feminist activist, and she actually allowed me to mention her name, Lynn Hashim, she complained about Western-based post-colonial feminists allegedly being more concerned with challenging their own government policies than engaging with local and regional dynamics in relation to the Middle East. Although at the time I disputed what I perceived to be a far too generalized and polarized representation of post-colonial feminist approaches and scholarship, and also pointed to the entanglement between Western interventions and local and regional developments and dynamics, her worries gave me reason to pause and reflect. And as I explained earlier, her concerns also overlapped with my own growing recognition of the significance of local and regional factors in shaping developments in Iraq, following the invasion of 2003. Now, while my misgivings in relation to my own work and approaches with respect to Iraq prompted me to rethink and reshift focus, there seemed to be a correspondence between my reflections and that of the LGBT activists and queer feminists who stressed the importance of recognizing local and regional factors in creating an environment in which being gay could be life-threatening, certainly carried the risk of being beaten up by the police, being abused in prison, arrested and detained. Yet it soon became obvious to me that there were strong tensions and divisions amongst LGBTQ activists, and that some strands of the movement were extremely problematic from my own political standpoint. Aside from feeling uncomfortable with the monopoly and hegemony of middle-class gay men within the movement, I also felt extremely uneasy about the political and financial ties to neoliberal and neoconservative bodies, especially linked to the US government. Particularly in Lebanon, activisms oriented towards sexual orientation and gender identities and expressions have shifted from grassroots organizing to formal organizations that are frequently funded by US institutions, which has contributed to a gradual recognition by the state in the Lebanese context. Now, many groups that were community and members oriented adapted their leadership and worked to NGOized structures that are project-based or that focus on service provision. In a jointly authored chapter with Riva Sayek, who is the founder and editor-chief of Kohol, we tried to intervene in current debates which we found too polarized and simplistic. We felt it was necessary to distance ourselves from both the purist claim that grassroots or community organizing are more authentic and radical than formalized structures of work, and the neoliberal claim that service provision and funded projects are the only possible ways of organizing on the ground. We wanted to question and challenge NGOization and the mainstreaming of LGBT rights and activism. With the deficit of transparency about funding that is systemic to NGOization, NGOs that monopolize regional human rights funding, particularly in Lebanon, tend to rely on funding sources that emanate from the same structures they historically positioned themselves against, such as imperialism and neoliberalism, hence obscuring the leftist history of LGBT movements in the region. Debates and tensions within the movement became particularly polarized during debates about pride and the significance of the rainbow flag amongst LGBTQ activists in Beirut in May of 2017. Since 2005 in Lebanon, activists have tried to commemorate Idaho, the International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia and Biphobia, by raising the rainbow flag and organizing events linked to Pride. However, for the first time in 2017, Pride in Beirut, which was organized by a joint platform of Lebanese LGBTQ organizations, received backing by international funders, Lebanese businesses, and the mainstream media. A week of events and activities was advertised openly and with great enthusiasm, although several queer feminists criticized the commercialization, neoliberalization, and single-issue focus of Pride, given the way that migrant workers and refugees have been treated and exploited in Lebanon, evidently with the complicity and allegedly even direct involvement of some of the organizations involved in organizing Pride. Lynn Darwish, a long-time queer feminist activist, articulated her discomfort the following way, I quote, "They use the rainbow flag and a pot of gold to draw us in and proceed to use our struggles to naturalize and instigate racialized violence and exploitation near us. This is called gay imperialism. It's a thing governments do. We should not fall for it, and yet most NGOs take pots of gold from these embassies. Some of the newer NGOs have been known to profit of the profession of gay and trans people and are now speaking loudly in their names. They have million-dollar budgets. Why do we let this happen? What is this silence? We should research their work. Ask them where they get their funds. Ask them how their budgets are allocated. Ask them about the sex exploitation rumors they're associated with." However, when threatened by religious parties, debates and tensions took a radical turn, divided queer feminists, and silenced any critique of the platform that organized Pride. The Muslim Ulama Organization, which is a Sunni group of religious scholars, evidently with ties to extremist organizations like al-Nusra and Daesh, ISIS, issued a warning and ultimatum on Facebook and demanded that a major event of the Pride Week program was to be cancelled. The Mufti and other religious authorities also got involved and asked the Minister of Interior to intervene and close down the event to be held at a hotel in Beirut. When the hotel received threats, it decided to cancel the event. According to a report endorsed by the organizers of Pride, at 22:28 on May 13th, the Muslim Ulama organization issued a public acknowledgement of the collaboration they received from the Minister of Interior and the Director General of the General Security and thanked them for acting quickly to put an end to the event. The next day, they issued another statement laying out an action plan to combat deviancy, in quotation marks, and deviance is a term they use to describe LGBTQ activists and people, in Lebanon in collaboration with government and religious authorities. Despite this apparent support by the minister and security, other events planned for the week went ahead. Yet the final event of the week had to be moved to a secure location after the organizers received a visit and warning from a security officer. While the threats and interference by the religious authorities and the collusion of government official and security prompted a strong reaction from LGBTQ and feminist activists across the spectrum, only a small group of queer feminist activists continued to articulate their misgivings about the way Pride had been organized and conceived. The majority decided to back the Pride organizing platform unconditionally. As one queer feminist activist and researcher put it, "I prefer the rainbow flag over the ISIS flag." When I questioned in a written exchange on Facebook why it would have to be an either-or, and also pointed out that US policies and interventions have contributed to the emergence of the ISIS flag, my intervention was largely dismissed, and I could sense that in this instance my view was dismissed on the basis of being a post-colonial academic based in the West. Now, given that the following year, Pride 2018, had to be abandoned after its main organizer, Hadian Damian, was detained by the Lebanese police and forced to sign a pledge to cancel all remaining events just after the opening, criticism of the framing, politics, and funding of Pride are understandably difficult to express. It would require a paper on its own to discuss and explore the multiple strands of tensions, miscommunication, and actual differences along both academia and activism on the one hand, as well as Middle East location versus Western location and institutional affiliations. Here I would merely like to stress that in my view, and as many feminists have argued on numerous occasions, the binary of knowledge production and activism is problematic and glosses over the complex ways in which funding, privilege, and constructions of authenticity work. Now I've lived in London for 24 years, and there, in the current context of a crisis of higher education, for example, it might be much easier for an Iraqi women's rights activist to obtain funding for a research project than a British-based academic whose job might be on the line in the context of widespread university cuts and savings. Now, this is not to deny the many privileges enjoyed by those of us inhabiting academia, nor do I want to belittle the historical hierarchies of knowledge production, which have clearly favored academic settings, especially Western academic settings. At this point, however, I think it is necessary to complicate our ideas about privilege, hierarchies, and abilities to engage in knowledge production. Moreover, activists, whether based in the Middle East or in Western context, have substantially different experiences, aims, and approaches. And we know feminist activists, even your more specific queer feminist activists, could be extremely divided and polarized in relation to specific issues. In the same way, I would also challenge simplistic constructions of authentic regional versus Western, which glosses over substantial differences within geographical settings, as well as the intricate and shifting ways we are all positioned politically, institutionally, and personally. Many academics and activists based in the Middle East are Western educated or have been attending Western institutions in the region. Clearly, the West itself is not homogeneous, both in terms of differences between countries, ranging from the US and Canada to various northern and southern European countries, but also within each country due to class, ethnicity, religious background, and increasingly important, the kind of politics people pursue. Both right-wing extremist and progressive politics cut across different countries in Western context and in the global South, including the Middle East. At the same time, what is often too casually referred to as Western academia, especially Western feminist scholarship, consists of a wide range of different epistemological, methodological, and theoretical approaches and politics. Contemporary feminist scholarship produced in Western institutions is very much shaped by academics coming from elsewhere, or having close personal, family, or political links to places outside North America and Europe. So I've previously argued that we need to escape our straitjackets of positionality in order to avoid misleading dichotomous approaches. Being based in London, Boston, or Providence, and facing racist, Islamophobic, and imperialist media representations and policy discourses on a daily basis inevitably shapes the way we think and write as feminist scholars and activists. But crucially, this struggle should not become our only and even main point of reference if we want to take solidarity and resistance against gender-based violence seriously. The point about complicating our analysis is not to prioritize some forms of violence or generalize violence to all women in all places. And it is certainly not to impose on women a choice between the rainbow and the ISIS flag. Rather, complicating the analysis requires us to see the connections, entanglements, and multiple forms of power configurations that impinge on people's lives. As feminist activists and scholars wherever based, we cannot avoid speaking simultaneously about corruption, political authoritarianism, sectarianism, the instrumentalization of culture and religion at local and regional levels, and I would add various instances of what Denise Candioti has coined masculinist restorations. Candioti suggests that under conditions of neoliberalism, high male unemployment, and increasingly precarious labor, and simultaneous increased aspirations and public presence of women, many states engage in crude means to maintain and reproduce patriarchy. So masculinist restorations refer to historically specific, regionally and locally configured processes and power configurations that contain authoritarianism, Islamism, and sectarianism, which all intersect with global structures pertaining to imperialism and neoliberal economics. I previously made the case that we need to engage in analysis and politics that address both macro and micro level configurations of power and inequalities. On reflection, I acknowledge that the idea of micro versus macro level of power configuration sets up another problematic binary that glosses over the dialectic and complex entanglements of modes of domination on oppression that are clearly linked and shaped by each other. So, for example, the emergence of ISIS in Iraq and Syria cannot be explained by reference to local cultures and religion alone, but must be put into historical and wider empirical contexts that are clearly shaped by imperialist and neocolonial policies. No doubt, violence and its multifarious sources, perpetrators, and forms of resistance are clearly manifest in our empirical realities. Yet as scholar activists, we are not only engaged in the attempts to understand, analyze, challenge, and fight violence, but we also struggle with its representations. Representations of violence in scholarship, in the media, in popular culture, and crucially, of course, in policy discourses. And they all reveal the complex and fraught ways our respective locations shape the registers we use to talk about and challenge violence against women and gender-based violence. Crucially, our framing and interpretations might also affect the already oppressive politics and policies of global governance and activate further their machineries. We are therefore collectively challenged to avoid dichotomous approaches in terms of the multi-level and complex power configurations that are constitutive of each other, but that can never be reduced to one or the other. Thank you.
Very inspiring and extremely important. And I have one question. I mean, I have many questions. This is a lot, but I'm very interested in going beyond dichotomous thinking and dichotomous separation that women that are in the struggle against violence are often faced with it. And I would really welcome if you could point to perhaps a few individuals or groups that are really trying to get beyond this dichotomous thinking, either or thinking in what they're doing on the ground and working with each other in that way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nadje, for such a really wonderful and inspiring talk. I see so many parallels between the experiences in the Middle East and North Africa and in Sub-Saharan Africa as well. And I think I posed the same question, about ways to go beyond dichotomous thinking and beyond thinking in terms of binary oppositions. I mean, I've seen similar challenges in the context of Sudan, for example. And you have demonstrated through your talk how to do that, right? But maybe make some suggestions as well. Have suggestions.
Is there anything I can do to maybe help or bring awareness to the situation over in the Middle East?
I start with the last one. Try to change your government. I think that's the best you can do. No, seriously. But of course, it's not just a matter of Trump. I think it's not just a matter of political party, but I guess also holding politicians in this country accountable and making sure that they are educated. And it's not that there's no, for instance, in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, it's not that there were, there were lots of experts, people in this country who knew about Iraq and who were writing and making recommendations, but they were just not taken seriously. So also to make sure that, politicians in this country do engage with people who have been for a long time working in specific context. Other than that, I guess, being open-minded and listening is very important. This is a big class. I'm sure there are people in the class that either have family or friends in the Middle East and, to sort of engage and find out, educate yourself in terms of reading and try to, when you see in your, I think the other big thing, I would say, you can challenge Islamophobia and racism in your everyday life more easily than do something about gender-based violence in the Middle East. I think that's more difficult. But I think, it's all linked. But again, I think, mobilize people to vote and it's beyond Trump. It's much bigger than Trump, of course. Yeah. Okay. So in terms of, and it's kind of linked, the question of some concrete names of organizations or initiatives that actually do this, that challenge binaries in the actual political struggle, and sort of linked to Nada's question about, examples of how you do it. So, yeah, I would say that there are lots of examples in the region. I've found more examples in places like Turkey, Lebanon, now also younger generation of feminist Egypt, than in a place like Iraq. So in Iraq, I have to say there is, and I think it has a lot to do with the situation. It forces activists into dichotomous positions, or it forces activists also into, well, I mean, in the very beginning of the invasion, it was actually quite drastic that you had the emerging feminist organizations. Some of them would take money from, what is it called, the Republican Institute or the Democratic. They both have, what are they called? Like the Democrat, yeah. So these are the kind of funding bodies linked to the main political parties. Without sort of thinking through what that would entail and the kinds of strings attached. So I think there's has been an involvement. But to now concretely say, in places like, for instance, the new generation of feminist activists, like you mentioned, Nasra, we both know Nasra, this is so feminist, like in their 20s and 30s. They're doing precisely that, I would argue. So they are critical of sort of, kind of macro structures. They're critical of Western intervention, imperialism, but they're also paying attention to regional and local issues. And they have managed to address previous taboo issues, around especially gender-based violence and sexuality. And the new generation of feminists in the region also feel much more confident to say, I'm a feminist, and not feel like when I did my research in the 90s on the Egyptian women's movement, there was this sense, feminism is a Western thing, so I can't call myself a feminist. I think that has really changed. I think the younger generation is much more confident to appropriate the term and actually to point to their own history. They seem to be also very aware of their own histories and point to the fact that at the beginning of the 20th century, in the context of anti-colonial struggle against the British, you actually had the first feminist group that emerged in Egypt, and likewise in Iraq and so on. Now in places, so that's one example. Now in Turkey is actually full of amazing organizations. The young, again, especially young generation of, I'm not saying Kurdish, Turkish feminists, who are, I would say, intersectional in their approach, in that they are, unlike the previous generations, they are, when they speak about, patriarchy and gender-based violence, they're critical of the state and the role of the Turkish state, at the same time engaging with local configurations of culture and power. But also they are much more sympathetic and in solidarity and engaged with the Kurdish struggle. So recognizing that the marginalization and the systematic discrimination on the basis of ethnicity and politics has to be part of the feminist struggle. There's an answer that relates to the actual activism that is happening, and then there's also the answer about how do you do that academically. So in terms of activists, I would say that there are more and more organizations, especially of young feminists in the region, who really try to challenge and defy this sort of binary thinking, and actually often use the term intersectional. Like the Lebanese, especially Lebanese queer feminist activists, are very much informed by Black feminist writing, and when they say that we don't want to just focus on single issue, we don't just want to focus on our gender identity or sexuality in a context where there's so much discrimination and gender-based violence against domestic migrant workers. So actually, queer feminists in Beirut work very closely with migrant women organizations in Beirut. And I would say that there is a big, in the Lebanese context, there's certainly a big division between the more identity politics, visibility, single issue focused LGBT activism, and then a queer feminist activism that is sort of much more intersectional. And that's, that's critical of the way that, even in the name of, obviously, they acknowledge that it is important to increase visibility and respectability and so on, but they say not in a context. We don't actually want the Lebanese state to pat us on the shoulder and say, yes, you can march and have pride, while at the same time they are torturing refugees and migrant workers. So, we don't want to be complicit and partner up with the state that is, engaging in so many atrocities in other contexts.
So, thank you so much for the thoughts that you
Thank
into
you.
this.